Hey everyone, back again. Now we're going to continue on with Noura Erakat, The Brilliance, Justice for Some. Today we're going to be covering chapters 2 and 3, titled Permanent Occupation and Pragmatic Revolutionary. So chapter 2 is going to cover the period from 1967 to 1973. And then chapter 3 is going to look at it in a lot more detail, the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, under Arafat's leadership, and their various legal strategies to try and attain Palestinian statehood and autonomy, and their many mistakes, as they made lots of them, and they a lot of bad things. Honestly, they deserve some criticism, but in the face of the Israeli occupation and violence against Palestinians, they are not even worth consideration at all. There is one culprit here, and that is Israel. Can't lose sight of that. But before jumping into it, consider donating to one of the organizations below, liking, sharing this. For every time you share me, though, make sure to share Palestinians, because we need to amplify Palestinian voices and perspectives and experiences, because they've been systematically erased for more than a century. And yeah, we got a lot to cover here. Let's jump into chapter 2. Permanent occupation, really covering the period from 1967 to 1973. Now, in 1967, Israeli Prime Minister Levi Eshkol sought settlements in the West Bank, but feared that the laws around occupation, internationally recognized occupation laws, would hinder his dream and would get the international community to come after him. So to get around this, they legislated that Palestinian land does not fall under the umbrella of occupation laws because it isn't a state. But as we saw last time, we know whose fault is that Palestine is not recognized as a state. So Israel denies them statehood and says that it is because they are not a state that therefore they can encroach on that land. Now, like a slimy snake, Eshkol managed to also get around these laws by saying that the settlements were temporary, which was a legal way to circumvent the law. But no settlement is truly temporary, right? But they interpreted the law as being that, well, as long as someday they get taken down, technically they're temporary, which could be said of anyone's land, can be said of anyone's home. Well, technically it might not be there forever. Eventually we'll take it down. They just said that, and then were able to gain international approval to avoid legal repercussions. Now, the other tricky thing our good old friend Eshkol did is to reduce them to a military nature. And this is part of the Israeli strategy as well, as they scream and cry about Hamas using, which we're going to get into Hamas a lot in this book as well, as they scream and cry about Hamas using human shields, they very conveniently ignore and try to distract from the fact that Israel arms its citizens along the border of Gaza and the West Bank and in settlements to treat them as the first line of defense in case of Palestinian resistance. They arm them. They treat them like human shields. They treat civilians like military personnel. And so they're able to say then, or Eshkol was back in 67, that these settlements are not pedestrian or civilian in nature, they're military in nature. So therefore, they are not breaching international law, because it is against the law to occupy a people and then start to set your own settlements there. That's just colonization. That's to set up colonies. It's to set up your own control of the region. Occupation law essentially states that if a nation and if a people are occupied, that they are only occupied temporarily with the goal of setting up permanent governance and autonomy there. Occupation can't be permanent. And they get around this by saying, like, oh, it's not permanent. Eventually it'll end. But at what point will that happen? You know, they just steadily encroach. And I wonder, I do wonder at what point Israel would say, yeah, all right, now's the time. I wonder if there would be a point. when they would do that. It's like those people who refuse to call for a ceasefire, who refuse to condemn Israel, who instead take to Twitter, who instead take to YouTube or whatever and scream about, I don't know, student protesters, or scream about some other nonsense, and don't say anything about the genocidal violence in Israel at all, or what the UN is now calling extermination. They don't say anything about any of that. I wonder how many dead Palestinians it would take for them to be like, wow, this is too far. You know those people that are holding out? Yeah, you know who they are. It's very fascinating, the amount of depravity there. So then Israel could then incrementally displace Palestinians with the steady establishment of what they called outposts. Outposts and settlements really go hand in hand. Now, 1967 was significant in many other ways as well. 1967 is when the Six-Day War took place, which was a war between Israel and some of the surrounding Arab states, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria. The surrounding Arab states, it lasted 6 days because Israel just demolished them, essentially. But the 1967 Six-Day Arab-Israeli War helped Israel in its encroachment. The war essentially started over a dispute over the demilitarized zone between Israel and Syria, where Israel was like provoking Syria. Israel was putting troops in the demilitarized zone, and the international community knew it. The UN Security Council took Syria's side. They're like, Israel, you gotta stop. Like, what are you doing? And so Syria eventually bit back because Israel was just breaking laws, essentially trying, it seems, to provoke this war that they knew they would win, to provoke their enemy into doing something that then Israel could respond with disproportionate force. Sound familiar? Now, at the time, Egypt was on high alert, and so were the other neighboring Arab states. Egypt being like southwest of Israel, and Lebanon to the north, and so on. So Israel was on a high alert. And then on June 5th, 1967, Israel attacked Egypt unprovoked. And over 6 days, like immediately, Israel just went through the Sinai Peninsula. So the Sinai Peninsula is like, if you know where Gaza is on a map and the surrounding Palestinian territory that some claim is Israel, if you look at Gaza on a map and go a little bit south into Egypt, there's that entire region from about Gaza to, or a little bit south of that, where Egypt's borders begin, to the Suez Canal. That is the Sinai Peninsula. And there, what Israel did, Israel just came in and immediately just like blew up all of Egypt's air potential, all their aircraft, unprovoked. They just destroyed it all, which is like, what? And Israel did this to then claim the entire Sinai Peninsula, which is extremely strategic. It's a very important plot of land strategically. Its attachment to the Suez Canal, which is very important. It's a huge swath of land, and Israel just took it over. Although Israel framed its actions as defensive, we can't ignore that Israel welcomed hostilities, in Erakat the Brilliant's words, welcomed hostilities too, in its effort to obtain more territory. Very common Israeli tactic here, to welcome hostility, to then respond with disproportionate force. And then they kept their troops there in the Sinai Peninsula because they framed it as defensive. And this will become something that Israel clings on to for a very long time, this logic around defense, where they eventually will apply this to civilians, specifically civilians in Gaza, Palestinians in Gaza, to say that Israel has a right to exercise fatal caution against civilian Palestinians out of a fear that they might be a threat. So out of defensiveness. So the international community was aghast. Like, the United Nations was absolutely not on Israel's side here. And they began to draft what would be called Resolution 242, which Israel caught wind of. And when Israel caught wind of it, they increased their seizures because they knew that Resolution 242, they didn't know what it was yet, Resolution 242 was going to go after Israel's expansive measures of expansion in the region. So after, during, and then following the Six-Day War in 1967, Israel took over East Jerusalem, the Gaza Strip. It set up civilian settlements in the West Bank and then in Golan Heights as well. This communicated to the U.S. that Israel does not really need it, interestingly enough. Israel showed off its military power and its willingness to just commit military violence just on the turn of a switch, flip of a switch, I should say, flip of a switch. They don't really need U.S. involvement there. They do, but they sent a clear message. However, though, at the time, the U.S. definitely needed Israel and other sympathetic Middle Eastern states like Iran and Jordan at the time to combat communism and procure oil trade routes so that, for the U.S.'s own economic sustainability. And then Egypt would join the ranks, and we'll get into the history of Egypt joining the U.S. and Israel eventually, and why there are tensions between Egypt and Hamas. Like, why do they not get along? And why are there tensions between Hamas and the PLO? I mean, we're going to get into all of that. And Israel's success in the 1967 Six-Day War essentially gave it carte blanche, free reign, to keep being militaristically aggressive, because they were able to do all that and get like zero resistance, which communicated to them from the international community and the quote-unquote West that they can do what they want. They would begin acting with little resistance. And in 1967, when it annexed eastern Jerusalem, which is under Palestinian territory within Palestinian control, the international community condemned it. The US and UK both refused to move their embassies to Jerusalem, something that eventually, for those of you that know, Trump would do in 2017. Trump moved the US embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem to signal to the world that Jerusalem is Israel's capital when it's really Palestinian territory. But this goes to show, this is how the US just does these symbolic gestures historically to be like, oh, Israel, don't do that. Oh, Israel did slap on the wrist. Don't do that. Moving their embassy. I mean, Israel doesn't care. Israel doesn't give a shit. They're just going to do whatever they want anyways. Oops, I sweared. Don't get too mad at me. They don't care. They're just going to do whatever they want. So you remember when I mentioned that Israel had caught wind of Resolution 242? I haven't told you what that was about yet. But get a load of this. I mean, this kind of blew my mind. I didn't know about this. Resolution 242. This is some BS. This is something else. So when the UN Security Council wrote up Resolution 242, they did it in two languages. They did it in English and French, a sign of its colonial history. And the two official, I guess these were the two languages that the document was written in. Now, there were minute differences between the two. Obviously, they're two different languages. But there was something so significant in the insignificance of the translation or not even the translation, they were written separately, one in French, one in English, that permitted Israel to continue its slaughter because of an issue around language, which goes to show just how careful you need to be in legal proceedings with language. So when this hinged on one line where Resolution 242 was calling for Israel to remove its forces and to give back the occupied territory. In the English, this line read, withdrawal of Israeli armed forces from territories occupied in recent conflict. Whereas the French, and I'll read it in French, retrait des forces armées israéliennes des territoires occupés lors du récent conflit. So, I mean, maybe you don't speak French. What does that mean? It means the same thing. It means the exact same thing. It means withdrawal of Israeli armed forces from territories occupied in recent conflict. However, the English lacks the definitive article the. It was lacking the word the. So, like in English, you can take certain liberties with language to omit words that you can't really do in French. So in English, you can say, that's the store I walked to. Or you could say, that is the store that I walked to. I mean, that they both make perfect sense. There's the store I walked to. There's the store that I walked to. You know, it makes perfect sense both ways. You can't really do that in French, or not really quite as easily. So within the English, it essentially implies, or it leaves ambiguous, what exactly the territories refer to and what the conflict refers to. So it just reads, withdrawal of Israeli armed forces from territories occupied in recent conflict. It's not directly attributing the territories occupied to the Israeli military and saying it's because it's the ones they are occupying, nor in which conflict. It could have been a conflict in Russia. Who knows? Like, what are they talking about here? Whereas in the French, retrait des forces armées israéliennes des territoires, from directly pointing to them being responsible or being a part of those, the territories that they are in. So they translates to like of the. I know French. It's easy, French. Oh God, do I know French? I don't. It's so brutal learning a language. It takes forever. So why did this matter? Well, Israel was just like, the French version doesn't exist. We're just using the English version. We only recognize the English version because they knew that the French version would directly implicate them in the exact thing that the versions were trying to say. And the UN came out and they're like, no, we mean these in the exact same way, in the French way. It's just that they weren't thinking about the way that the language would be used to essentially as justification for Israel to pretend to play ignorant, to pretend as though they don't know what the resolution is referring to, which territories, which conflict. Like how slimy is that, really? Everyone knows what it means. But it goes to show, and this is what Erakat the Brilliant is trying to emphasize so clearly, is that law almost means nothing on its own. Power actually determines what law is able to do. Doesn't matter if you have the best arguments on your side. In the face of power, it doesn't matter at all, because power is going to greatly influence the possibility for that law to do anything. Okay, so back to occupation law. So normally under occupation law, or not, occupation law states that an occupier must protect the people that it's occupying and maintain peace until they establish a sovereign authority, which should happen in a timely manner. And as we've said, because Israel never recognized Palestinian sovereignty, it could brand their occupation as sui generis, that is to say, as unique. They're like, oh, well, occupation law doesn't apply to us because the Palestinians are not a state. They don't have a state. So therefore, this law doesn't apply. Now, someone intent on discrediting the last point might point to Palestinians' refusal of the 1947 Resolution 181, which was the partition plan. Because Palestinians were like, we don't want this state. They weren't rejecting the idea of a state qua state. They were rejecting the terms set forth by their colonizers as to what their state should look like, how much territory they should have, when they should have been given the right to all of their territory. It should have been placed under a single democratic government that would have been elected by all the people there and likely would have gone in favor of the Palestinians. And it's also to greatly narrow the path by which a people might earn a recognized state. It doesn't just come about through the acceptance of the conditions of your colonizer. If that were the case, no state would have ever emerged in the first place, because the first states were not those that were being colonized. See what I'm saying? They were the ones who would eventually be colonizers. There are many other ways. I mean, you just have to look at the fact that the Palestinians had their own tax, judicial, political, hospital, and railway systems. I mean, these are all signs of having a state, an organizing political governing body. I mean, all of these things were in place, and it seems like, many of you might be listening to this and like, yeah, obviously we know this is the Israeli tactic, but I mean, I think it's still important to stress and really highlight just how deeply entrenched this idea within Israel is that Palestine and Palestinians are somehow less deserving of rights than others. In fact, And interestingly, when Britain put Palestine under its mandate and put it under its control, it gave it what was called Class A mandate status, as opposed to Class B or Class C. You might be like, what does that mean? This class system was used to designate and to separate the various colonies of Britain and other, I think it was just under British rule, as to their level of sophistication. So Palestine was the most sophisticated in the British's eye, which is problematic, right? To be like, oh, well, it is because of the British recognition. Obviously, that's problematic. But, as an interesting fact, by 1946, Palestine was the only occupied Class A country that had still been under occupation. All the other ones, all other countries that had that had received a Class A status by Britain had been liberated by 1946. But in any case, occupation laws are still meant to protect civilians, especially the ones that Israel has been slaughtering since 1948. And if you thought they couldn't get any slimier, let me introduce you to, excuse my pronunciation, Meir Shanyar, Israel's military advocate general from 1961 to 1968. He opposed the Fourth Geneva Convention relating to occupation that deals with occupied territories on the basis that Israel never formally agreed to them. Never formally agreed, so therefore they were somehow exempt. Which is like, can someone who commits murder be like, well, I never agreed to the existence of these laws, so therefore it doesn't apply to me? However, he had no problem accepting the similar Hague regulations with the Hague in the Netherlands. Hague in the Netherlands. The Hague regulations that conveniently did not stipulate anything about civilian settlement in its consideration of the treatment of occupied territories. So the Fourth Geneva Convention says that you cannot create civilian settlements, like an occupier cannot create settlements within an occupied territory. So this guy, Meir Shanyar, and the other Israeli officials were like, well, okay, that's not good. Let us respect instead the Hague regulations that instead make no mention of civilian settlements. So Israel is like, oh, we love that one. That one's great. The Hague regulation's amazing. In order to justify their continued settlement building in the West Bank. Now, in 1975, this ding-dong, that is Meir Shanyar, became Israel's chief Supreme Court justice, a position he would hold for 20 years. A guy who believed that Israel did not need to follow the Fourth Geneva Convention because it didn't agree to it, then occupied Israel's Supreme Court. Like, as though this is just like a political issue in Israel. It extends so much further than that. It's unbelievable. So what has Israel's Supreme Court done? Well, they've been really useful for the Israeli regime. They've been really useful to get around the PR nightmare that would be their recognizing that they are occupying a people. So to get around this, Israel's Supreme Court always claims that they are only, quote-unquote, administering the land, not occupying it. Of course, the term administration conveys or evinces the idea that these people here, Palestinians, are somehow incapable of administering themselves. And they claim to be doing it until a political agreement arrives, so they could just do it indefinitely. In Erakat the Great's words, the occupation could be indefinite so long as it was not permanent, which is a very, very slimy use of this idea here, that because it might not be permanent, they can get away with it, even if it may very well be permanent until the people are officially, as the UN now acknowledges, are exterminated. Now, in 1967, the slimy Supreme Court passed Order 59 that allowed a military commander to assume control of state property in the West Bank and Gaza to bypass the law that they couldn't steal private land. So they put in this law that, yeah, sure, civilians can't steal private land, but a military person can, a commander can, which could then be used to steadily encroach upon the territory through military rule, essentially. So the courts permit Israel to enjoy all the privileges of being an occupier and sovereign, essentially, while Palestinians get none of the protections of being occupied at all. So Israel gets to have its cake and gets to eat it too. So then we have to, just to reconsider, like, the way that they use the same argument of, oh, well, it's not permanent, it's only temporary, but we have no idea when that temporary is going to end, like in their creation of civilian settlements. They say they can get around it by being like, oh, they aren't permanent settlements, which is, we should go and ask. This is how we get around this. Ask anyone living there, do you plan on living here indefinitely? And if the answer is yes, then it's permanent and it's breaking international law. But in any case, I assume nobody there, unless they've been briefed, would be like, yeah, this is a temporary stay in our well-protected, well-built settlement on Palestinian land. Now, interestingly, as I mentioned before, this turns settlers into human shields, which is probably why Israel arms them, which is a crime under international law. As always, the U.S. responded with some finger-wagging, was like, oh, don't do that, Israel, and then continued to fund them, continued to send them money to continue their occupation of Palestinian territory. Okay, like, we've gone so far here, and we haven't talked about the PLO at all, the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Well, let's just let's get into it. Up to and just after 1967, Jordan, Egypt, and Israel were in a tug-of-war over the West Bank, because the West Bank has not just been occupied by Israel. Jordan has held a lot of power over the West Bank over the years as well, which is obviously a problem. They were all in a tug-of-war over the West Bank. This allowed a unique opportunity for Palestinian organizing, although the PLO wasn't very popular at the time, back in the late 60s. That changed when Israel attacked a refugee camp in Jordan and essentially suffered heavy losses. So the PLO, under the Fatah, they weren't part of the PLO then, but Fatah, that was run by Yasser Arafat, was operating out of Jordan in various refugee camps. Now, what they did is they actually kind of set a trap where Palestinian guerrilla fighters and Jordanian military people were in this camp, in this refugee camp that Israel attacked, because they have a track record of attacking refugee camps. And the Palestinian guerrilla fighters under the Fatah, under Arafat's leadership, alongside the Jordanian military people, really defeated the Israelis. Defeat might be an exaggerated term. In any case, they showed the world that guerrilla warfare and some amount of sophistication is enough to defeat the Israeli military. And this showed the world and Palestine and Palestinians just how effective the Fatah, the party, was under Arafat's leadership. And then he became leader of the PLO. Now, in 1973, Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack against Israel, severely damaging perceptions of Israel's strength. They ultimately lost, but this was another sign to the world that Israel was not untouchable. And it also created a great amount of momentum for the PLO to drum up its own battles, politically, legally, and militarily. And that puts us here into Chapter 3, Pragmatic Revolutionaries. Now, in 1974, Arafat delivered a speech at the United Nations representing Palestine. The US and Israeli ambassadors were suspiciously absent, but this was such a significant event where a Palestinian representing Palestine was delivering a speech at the United Nations. It's extremely significant, and Arafat's success here cannot be understated. But Arafat's speech was part of a broader trend of previously colonized and occupied people and territories speaking at the United Nations. Between 1945 and 1974, the number of represented states increased from 51 to 138, with many being previously colonized or occupied. Arafat's speech stood as a sign of oppressed nations standing against the West and their colonizers. And many of these states that had been previously colonized and that recognized how the West was weaponizing the courts, the international courts, was siding with evil oppressive regimes like Israel. All of these states, or many of these states, then formed what was called the Non-Aligned Movement, or NAM. And the Non-Aligned Movement was obviously a big thorn in the West's side. So the PLO was instrumental in aligning Palestinian groups like Fatah and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. It helped to bring these groups together in a unified mission of opposing Israel, of establishing statehood, and of freeing Palestine. Until 1970, the PLO worked out of Jordan. So that was their primary place. You remember we said that they were in Jordan when it was attacked by Israel. That was where the refugee camp was, and that's where they worked for the most part. At which point, though, in the early 70s, 1970, they eventually relocated to Lebanon to do reconnaissance and to organize armed resistance. And in response, Israel held no punches. They were very willing to make up for their embarrassment when they tried to invade Jordan and when they tried to brutally murder people in refugee camps, which they would then continue to do well into Lebanon. Now, Israel began an onslaught of Lebanon here, and this would continue well into the 80s. This was a big part of the Israeli strategy, was to bombard Lebanon as often as possible, knowing that the PLO was working out of there. But Israel's violence against the PLO, the Palestinians, the Lebanese, it was justified with the broader hegemonic push. That is, it was believed by the West that Israel was committing just actions here. And it was also doing so under the auspices of delegitimizing non-state forms of resistance, which was part of the West's broader effort to delegitimize the non-aligned movement of previously colonized, now liberated states in their continued struggle against oppression. So here we see the kernels of the creation of this category called the terrorist, because one of the West's strategy is to delegitimize armed resistance and to delegitimize a fight against oppressive powers by calling it terrorism, which immediately evokes among the minds and hearts of many people who consume regular day-to-day type mass media, it evokes a lot of fear. You know, the term, it includes the term fear in it, terror, terrorist, as the stand-in for all non-state violence. And it invokes terror precisely because it does not abide by the logics of statehood that Israel and the US and other Western states so firmly cling to. And in part, this was one of the PLO's shortcomings, is that they were quite willing to adopt this state logic because they wanted statehood. They had to. It's something we can criticize them for, but again, I'm committed to the idea that they do not deserve any criticism. All the criticism should be directed towards Israel. And within the PLO, this essentially splintered their leadership. There were two strands of thought within the PLO. There was the pragmatic side, and then there was the rejection front, where the pragmatic side, and this would become a major element of Camp David, of the Oslo Accords, where there was this split in PLO representation and kind of the PLO ideological framework in how it wanted to oppose Israel, where the pragmatic side was just content with statehood. It was more willing to do the legal channels, to appease the right people, to attain statehood, whereas the rejection front wanted to, an entire revolution, to upend Zionist settler sovereignty, where many countries capitalized on these tensions then to satisfy their own interests. Jordan still wanted control of the West Bank, and it took advantage of this fact, this split within the PLO, to insert itself in these movements. As we will come to see as well, and other nations would take advantage of this, the only way in many cases, for the Palestinians to have a seat at negotiating tables was if they formed a delegation with Jordan. They could not represent themselves alone, which signals, and Jordan has always had kind of a tenuous relationship with the Palestinians, a little bit of siding with Israel, a little bit of not, a little back and forth. Then there was Egypt. Egypt wanted the Sinai Peninsula back that it lost in the 6-Day War. Sinai Peninsula just south of Gaza. And so the U.S. worked with Egypt without Palestinians present to try and figure out how they can get back the Sinai Peninsula while also ostensibly easing tensions in the Middle East. Now, whenever this happens, like so-called peace processes and whatever, it was always done by excluding the Palestinians. Or at least excluding the Palestinians as a sovereign authority to speak on behalf of themselves. Now, this splintering within the PLO couldn't really remain forever because they knew that they were being pressured by Egypt, by Jordan, by the US, obviously by Israel, and so they had to unite in their push for recognition. They worked together to conduct armed revolts, to mount legal pressure, and to curry favor with the non-US allied Arab states. Of course, they had to adopt language that appealed to their oppressors. I mean, this is part, colonized people have to do this. I don't think they have to, but in a lot of cases, they certainly are forced to in order to live, to get anything at all. Like that their goal, for example, is to liberate quote-unquote Palestinian territory, which is to say only the territory that remains for them, instead of all of Palestine, from the grips of Zionist expansion and colonialism. But behind closed doors, the PLO is clear. They wanted it all back, but they were trying to do what they could in order not to be branded like terrorist extremists so that they could actually earn a seat at the table. Did it work in their favor that way? No. Taking the diplomatic, legal, political route has not worked that much historically for the Palestinians. It hasn't earned them very much. The PLO relied heavily on guerrilla warfare as well, though. They weren't simply just trying to do diplomatic political changes. They relied heavily on guerrilla warfare because what else are they going to do? Right? If you're a people that have tried repeatedly for peaceful resistance and none of it has worked, what other option do you have? As your enemy is still encroaching on your territory, is coming closer and closer and closer to you. As JFK said, those who make peaceful revolution impossible make violent revolution inevitable. But even adopting armed struggle was a double-edged sword. Of course, it inflicted some damage against their oppressor, but it also was used to intensify Palestinian repression in the creation of this idea in the early 70s of the terrorist, which pretty much all Palestinians would come to be associated with, even civilians. The UN didn't buy into it, though. The creation of this terrorist is kind of this Israel-US concoction. The UN didn't buy it, though, in 1972. And in 1973, they passed a resolution legitimizing armed struggle against colonial and foreign domination. And this was really the natural progression of the UN over the few years before it, because 4 years before 1973, when they justified armed struggle, the UN, with the work of the Red Cross and legal scholar George Abisab, organized a diplomatic conference that allowed freedom fighters to attend, setting the stage for them to be recognized in what they called embryonic sovereignty, like the roots of sovereignty. Now, obviously, the US and Israel opposed this. They opposed this entirely because they recognized that this would be justification for the PLO to keep using guerrilla warfare. And so the US and Israel did not recognize the value of armed resistance. They did not recognize the value of legitimate armed struggle against occupation, and instead just continued to call these people terrorists. It took a ton of lobbying. This is all still leading up to how we started the chapter, with Arafat delivering his speech in 1974. And with this, it took a lot of lobbying, it took a ton of work, but there was this gradual move within the UN to recognize the importance of giving a space for freedom fighters against oppression in the United Nations or in the UN. And it took a ton of lobbying, but finally in 1974, Arafat could go to the UN to address the international community on the state of the Palestinian, or on behalf of the Palestinian people. The first time, in Erakat the Great's words, a non-state actor had taken the international podium, which is such a significant event that Arafat was the first to represent the Palestinians. And still, this is 1974. 50 years ago. This is 50 years ago when they were fighting the struggle. And they still have not earned what they've been fighting for. Like, what other options are available to them? I'd love comments. You know, a lot of internet people are real geniuses. They know all the answers. What are they supposed to do? You know, what are you supposed to do if you're put in that situation after 50 years of struggle, of legal, diplomatic, political, military struggle? You are not given the basic recognition of statehood. What's going on? What should be done? What should Palestinians do? Now, Arafat's speech was co-written by a few people. It was co-written by Mahmoud Darwish, who was a brilliant Palestinian poet and writer. And his speech was very successful. He advocated for a secular one-state solution, one that wasn't just for Jewish people, which is like, Israel is not a secular state. It's a state that privileges Jewish people over others, in that it guarantees Jewish people the right to live there no matter where they are in the world, while denying Palestinian Palestinians, that same right on the basis of religion. Right? Like, isn't that just a fact? And he advocated for a secular one state, which would be a point that Hamas would come to really disagree with about 14 years later, when they would come into existence. Because Hamas was born out of the Muslim Brotherhood. They don't want a secular state. But in any case, getting ahead of ourselves here. His speech was successful. It pushed the UN to put forward Resolution 3236 that affirmed Palestinian right to self-determination and rights of refugees to return home beyond just in Gaza and the West Bank. Unlike Resolution 242, it did not hinge Palestinian autonomy on Israel's right to exist, which is something I haven't really mentioned yet, which is on me. But the previous resolutions and many of the other moments, and that we will come to see, where Palestinians are given any kind of recognition, always comes at the price. We will get more into this, but it's been the case so far. Always comes at the price of a few things. But the primary thing is that Palestinians acknowledge that Israel has a right to exist, which is just them saying that they are not advocating for a one-state solution. It's pretty much just saying that Israel is just always going to be there, which, of course, Palestinians are not prepared to accept. Israel's not accepting them in the right for them to be there. Why should they do that to Israel? Or I put it to you. I wonder how many people here, or put it to your family members. You might have some family members who are very sympathetic to Israel. You think they're victims in all of this. Ask them. Just put forward that situation. If you are an occupied people, occupied for about 100 years, and your occupier is saying the only way you can get to the negotiation table is if you say you believe that the occupier should be there and should always be there. Wonder how many of them would be like, yeah, I love that. Great. So the successes would keep coming for a bit. After Arafat's speech, the UN would pass Resolution 3236 and 3237, which gave Palestinians a non-voting seat in the UN, which is a success, right? It's not, the best thing, but it's still good. Arafat and the PLO drew from South Africa's anti-apartheid movement to inform the way that they framed their struggle and Arafat's speech. In 1974, the UN expelled South Africa, and Arafat sought the same state for Israel. I said that weird. In 1974, due to South African anti-apartheid movement with Nelson Mandela, with so many others, the UN expelled South Africa. And Arafat saw this and was like, we can do this with Israel. Israel has Palestinians living in an apartheid state, so you should be able to oppose them. Now, to do this, like South African anti-apartheid movement did, Arafat tried to appeal with other Middle Eastern states and African states to, have this done, many of which had been occupied before. So Egypt put up some resistance, though, because it still wanted to reclaim the Sinai Peninsula, and some other African states were also not so eager because of some apathy from other Arab states towards African suffering. So this is another big issue where there were many African states who had been colonized, like Algeria and others, that didn't have the greatest impression of some Arab states who they thought were quite apathetic towards them, which many of these African states then aligned with the Palestinian struggle, which is, I don't know, I can't say if that's legitimate or not, but these are some of the difficulties that the Palestinians confronted in trying to unite this non-aligned movement against Israel. Now, Egypt was super willing to cozy up to the U.S. because it really wanted its Sinai Peninsula. It was dealing with Kissinger. They were having a great time, just doing everything they can to advance Egypt's interests at the expense of Palestinians. They didn't care. Actually, they aligned themselves so firmly with the U.S. that they began to vote alongside the U.S. against the PLO on voting matters. Now, the U.S.'s response to the PLO went, "We will allow you at the negotiation table if you," and these are the main points that Israel had to accept, "if you recognize Israel, if you renounce armed resistance, and accept Resolution 242 and 338. And 242, which, the ambiguous one that was like, pull your troops from occupied territories. And Israel was like, which troops? Which territories? And I don't know. It could be anything. And so the PLO saw right through this. They were not going to just accept this. They're not going to renounce armed resistance. That's one of their only military tools available to them. They had, at the time, they had like one plane. Like they couldn't, what were they going to do? Now, after resolutions 3236 and 3237 passed that gave Palestinians a seat at the UN, almost nothing changed because Israel had the American guns and veto power on their side. Like they had the American military and veto power, which is the most absurd thing within the entire UN, I think, that all the countries of the world that participate can vote on something and the US can just say, nope. It's like, what kind of a democracy is this? The same democracy that the US has killed hundreds of thousands of Iraqis for. And this shows that Israel and the US have more rights as nations than all of the other countries combined. Like, what kind of a world is this? It boggles the mind. Now, in response, some of these countries like Somalia, Libya, Cuba began to wage what Erakat calls an ideological war by equating Zionism with racism, colonialism, apartheid, and domination. It was part of a broader PR effort to drum up international knowledge and consciousness about the horrors of Zionism in its treatment of Palestinian people. Zionism says, like it just says, that any Jew has a right to that land, while no non-Jews have any right to that land. And hence, it is discriminatory. It is discriminatory against Palestinians. But Palestinian Christians, Muslims, like all of them. Anyone who's not a Jew in that part of the world. And this idea garnered much support at the UN, and it's being adopted in Resolution 3379. That is, the idea of Zionism being colonialism, being racism, which was ostensibly put in place in 1975, but, its actual effectiveness it's up in the air, whether or not it did anything. But in response, the U.S. cut funding to the UNRWA, or to the UN, and that's another U.S.-Israeli strategy, is cut funding to the United Nations when you don't agree with them, when the United Nations is trying to act like the United Nations. So it looked like progress was being made. Up till the mid-70s, the PLO was making progress, steady, but real progress. However, in the mid-70s, early 70s, Lebanon was going through a civil war, which was sort of good for the PLO to some extent. It was kind of good for the PLO because they could operate there fairly easily. There was no real leadership to kick them out or decide what's going on. However, Syria feared that a PLO confrontation with Israel would hurt them. Syria feared that the PLO was going to take advantage of this a little too much and dragged them into a war with Israel that Syria was not prepared to fight. And so they got involved to essentially stabilize Lebanon. This is, I mean, Syria, they're being diplomatically intelligent in order to, for their own interests, not for the Palestinians, for their own interests. Like, they knew that they had to stabilize Lebanon to make sure that the PLO was not going to attack Israel. And they got involved to stabilize it, fracturing Arab solidarity in the region, which the PLO was relying on. Now, the PLO's hopes fell deeper when the 1978-1979 Camp David Accords settled peace between Israel and Egypt, ruining years of Palestinian and Egyptian coordination. If they're, how good this coordination was is up in the air. But Egypt just wanted the Sinai Peninsula back, and they got it back through the Camp David Accords. During Camp David, the Israelis at the table only dealt with quote-unquote Palestinians, not with the Palestinian people. So they're like, there are Palestinians here who are saying words that have no attachment to a people at all, which is how they were able to be like, yeah, none of this is going to be binding in terms of setting up a Palestinian state. We're just dealing with some random Palestinians. Which is another clever use of law in justifying their ownership, their command, their occupation of the territory. And we get a lovely passage by Menahem Begin, the Israeli prime minister, the Zionist terrorist turned Israeli prime minister. He led many raids against Palestinians, including the Deir Yassin massacre, before Israel even existed, who said that the Palestinians, in his words, did not exist. Rather, they are, in his words, Palestinian Arabs residing in Judea, Samaria, and the Gaza district, to completely erase the existence of Palestine. This is their mandate. This is what they have to do to justify their own existence and occupation of the territory. So Begin's influence, Begin, the Zionist terrorist turned Israeli prime minister, his influence in the West Bank was only just beginning. He began to appoint pro-Israeli Palestinians to leadership roles to counter insurgency and to facilitate Israeli settlement expansion. This was a dirty trick where Begin started to meet with local leaders in Palestine and set up these municipal heads within various regions of the West Bank that were sympathetic with Israel, that were sided with Israel. Israel would pay them, they'd make some good money, they'd be able to benefit their families, yada, yada, yada. And they were essentially going to place all the Palestinians in their territory under a kind of control, kind of proxy control through these Palestinians who happened to be on Israel's side. It was meant to try and help to facilitate settler expansion in Palestine and to limit counterinsurgency, or to increase counterinsurgency in the region. Of course, Palestinians saw right through this and protested this to end it. Now, when sneaky diplomatic colonial tricks proved to be effectless or ineffective, Israel decided to invade Lebanon to attack and dismantle the PLO operating in Beirut in 1982, which was a huge massacre. They didn't dismantle the PLO, but forced it to reposition it into Tunisia. And this greatly hindered the PLO because they didn't have the same border access to Israel to launch any attacks, to do reconnaissance, to do anything like that. This was a huge hit to the PLO. It seemed like the Israeli regime wanted to kill Arafat. They couldn't do it. Arafat was hanging out in Beirut and drinking coffee and playing chess, doing all that kind of stuff, doing his political work. They couldn't kill him, and they got the PLO to move, which was not good for the PLO. And in 1987, Palestinians launched their first uprising. And here we're going to get the first of two intifadas in Palestine. That was, translates to uprising more or less. And this actually had a big effect on the PLO, a negative effect, for a good reason. Because the PLO was growing detached from the people in Palestine. And this would come to be reflected in the Oslo Accords and other meetings, where the PLO steadily from the late 70s onwards wasn't really representing the Palestinians as well as they could, or the Palestinian cause. And the Intifada was primarily an attack against Israel, an uprising against Israel, nonviolent uprising against Israel, but also against their representatives in the PLO, who were no longer really representing them, or representing them in the way that the Palestinians wanted them to. And, you know, people in Palestine, they weren't feeling represented for obvious reasons, but also because the representatives were in Tunisia and Lebanon. They weren't even in Palestine. So they're like, we need people here who will do this work. And that'll put us here getting into more detail about the Intifadas, 1987, then in 2000. And we're going to get into the creation of Hamas next time. And Oslo peace process next time. We're going to cover chapters 4 and 5. But yeah, we'll end that there for now. If you like what I did, you can share Palestinian voices, share so many things that you can. Try to contribute to some of the organizations I've listed below if you are able. Yeah, if there's anything I got wrong, anything that I excluded, I'd love to hear about it. You can leave a comment everyone can see. That'll be great. And yeah, on that note, take care.